Here's a brief introduction about me before I take you into the moment that changed everything. My name is Aaron. I'm 42 years old, and for most of my life, I've worked with my hands. 20 years in a factory, grinding through long shifts, taking pride in providing for my family. It wasn't glamorous, but it was honest work. Then one day, without warning, it was gone. The company packed up, moved overseas, and left us with nothing but a severance check that didn't even last 6 months. After that, it was survival mode. Odd jobs, construction, working as a night janitor, anything to keep the lights on. But it was never enough. My wife, she had dreams bigger than scraping by. She left, took the kids, and didn't look back. I don't blame her, but it left me with this weight, this anger that wouldn't go away. That's what led me here, into this little coffee shop, where my anger boiled over in a way I didn't expect. You think you're better than the rest of us, don't you? The words were out of my mouth before I even realized I had spoken them. They cut through the cozy murmur of the cafe, silencing conversations, freezing hands halfway to coffee cups. The barista stiffened, her fingers twitching toward the phone. The man I was yelling at didn't flinch. He closed his book carefully, setting it down as if he had all the time in the world. When he lifted his eyes to meet mine, there was no anger, no superiority, just quiet patience. I wasn't expecting that. I took a step closer, my fists clenched at my sides. You think you can sit here like you're one of us? You've had everything handed to you. His expression didn't change. I'm not sure what's bothering you, he said, his voice low and even. But maybe we can talk about it. Talk? My laugh was bitter, sharp. What could someone like you possibly have to say to someone like me? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he gestured to the empty chair across from him. Maybe you're right about me. Maybe I don't understand. But if you sit down, maybe you can show me what I'm missing. For a moment, I hesitated. My body was still humming with anger, but there was something about the way he spoke, calm, steady, that made me pause. I had stormed in here ready for a fight, ready to unleash the bitterness that had been festering inside me for years. But now I wasn't sure what I wanted. I looked around. The whole cafe was watching, waiting to see what I'd do. Fine, I muttered, pulling out the chair. You want to know what it's like to be me? I'll tell you. I wasn't sure why I started talking, but once I did, the words wouldn't stop. I told him about the factory shutting down, about the promises of help that never came. I told him about working 2, sometimes 3 jobs just to keep my head above water, about coming home exhausted, hands raw from labor, knowing it still wasn't enough. And then I told him about my wife, how she had looked at me one night, really looked at me, and realized she didn't see the man she had married anymore, how she packed up the kids the next day and drove off. My voice cracked. I looked down at my hands, at the calluses that told the story of every sacrifice I had made. I don't blame her, I said, quieter now, but it broke me. When I looked up, he was still watching me, his face unreadable. Around us, the cafe had fallen into complete silence. People who had been sipping their lattes, typing on their laptops, they were all listening now. And then I see people like you, I continued, my voice rising again, sitting here, drinking your expensive coffee like you don't have a care in the world. You have money, power, fame, and it makes me so mad I can't see straight. No matter how hard I work, I will never have what you have. He didn't rush to answer. He let my words settle, like he was giving them the weight they deserved. Finally, he spoke. I don't know what it's like to walk in your shoes, he admitted, but I do know what it's like to be judged before I even say a word. I scoffed. You? Judged? You're the president. People worship you. He shook his head slowly. Not everyone, he said. Some people look at me and only see what they want to see. They don't see me. They see what they think I represent. I opened my mouth to argue, but then I stopped. Because hadn't I done the exact same thing? Hadn't I walked in here and decided I knew everything about this man before he had even spoken? He leaned forward, his hands folded on the table. I'm not saying our struggles are the same, he continued. They're not. But pain. Pain is something we all understand, even if it comes from different places. And maybe if we talked about it more, If we really listened, we'd realize we're not as different as we think. Something in me shifted. My shoulders, which had been rigid with tension, loosened just a little. "You really believe that?" I asked. "I do," he said simply. "And I think, deep down, you do too. Otherwise, you wouldn't have sat down." I looked away, blinking hard. My throat was tight, my chest heavy in a way that had nothing to do with anger and everything to do with the years of resentment I had been carrying. I exhaled slowly. "You're not what I expected," I admitted. "Not at all." He smiled faintly, not with smugness, but with something closer to understanding. "Sometimes we hold on to anger because it's easier than holding on to pain." The words hit harder than I wanted them to. I pushed back my chair and stood, smoothing out my worn jacket. "I don't know why you listened to me," I said, my voice rough but sincere. "But thank you." He rose too, extending his hand. "Thank you for sharing your story. It takes courage to speak your truth." I hesitated for only a moment before shaking his hand. His grip was firm, steady, grounding. As I turned to leave, I glanced back one last time. "Good luck, Mr. President," I said. Then I walked out. Behind me, the café seemed to exhale. The tension had lifted, replaced with something else. Something quieter, more reflective. People exchanged small smiles. A woman paid for a stranger's coffee. The barista relaxed her shoulders. I didn't know what had just happened, but for the first time in a long time, the anger that had weighed me down didn't feel quite so heavy. I stepped out onto the cobblestone street, the crisp Boston air filling my lungs. The sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows on the pavement. My body felt lighter somehow, though I couldn't quite put my finger on why. The anger, the weight of years of disappointment and frustration, it wasn't gone, not entirely, but something had shifted. I turned the collar of my jacket up against the cold and started walking, not entirely sure where I was heading. My hands were still shaking, but it wasn't from rage this time. It was something else, something unfamiliar. I kept replaying his words in my head. Sometimes we hold on to anger because it's easier than holding on to pain. Was that true? Had I been holding on to my anger because it was the only thing keeping me upright? I passed by a group of workers unloading boxes from a truck. They moved with purpose, each lift and heave a familiar rhythm. I had done that work. I knew the ache that settled into your bones at the end of the day, the kind of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could erase. One of them caught my eye, a younger guy, maybe late 20s, his hoodie pulled tight over his head. He looked at me like he recognized something in my face. "You good, man?" he asked. I hesitated. It was a simple question, but for some reason I didn't have a simple answer. "Yeah," I said finally, though I wasn't sure if it was true. He nodded and went back to work, and I kept walking. When I got back to my apartment, if you could call it that, it was the same as I had left it. Small, dimly lit, a mattress on the floor, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the counter. The rent was past due. Again. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the peeling paint on the walls. I had spent so many nights here, stewing in bitterness, letting it fester, letting it build. The loneliness had been easier when I could blame someone else for it. But now, after that conversation, after looking into the eyes of a man who had every reason to dismiss me but didn't, I felt exposed. Like someone had peeled back a layer I hadn't even realized was there. I reached for the bottle, my fingers curling around the neck, but then I stopped. For the first time in years, I didn't want it. Instead, I grabbed my phone and stared at the screen. The last text from my ex-wife was 6 months old. Just a one-word reply. "Okay." I thought about the kids. I hadn't seen them in too long. Before I could second-guess myself, I tapped her name and started typing. "Can I see them? Even just for a little while?" I hovered over the send button, my thumb hesitating. She had every reason to ignore me, to say no. But still, I hit send. The message delivered. No read receipt, no typing bubble. I set the phone down and exhaled, my chest tight. Maybe she wouldn't answer. Maybe she would. But for the first time in a long time, I was trying. And somehow that felt like a step forward. Shirdi Soniri. So the next morning, I woke up to a reply. Maybe. Let me think about it. It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either. I sat up, rubbing my hands over my face. The sunlight filtered in through the dirty blinds, cutting through the shadows in streaks. Maybe, I thought, was more than I deserved. But it was something. I got dressed and left the apartment without touching the whiskey bottle. Sorry, continue. Right, I found myself back at the cafe that afternoon. I didn't know why. The place was quieter this time. Fewer people, a slower rhythm. The barista, the same one from the day before, glanced up when I walked in. Her gaze lingered for a second, like she was trying to figure me out. "Black coffee," I said. She nodded, turning to make it, and I took a seat. I wasn't expecting him to be there, but he was. Donald Trump, sitting at the same corner table, his book open in front of him. He looked up when he saw me. I almost turned around and walked out. But something in his eyes stopped me. He didn't say anything, didn't gloat, didn't smirk, just gave me a small nod. I sighed and sat down at a table across the room. A few minutes later, my coffee arrived. I wrapped my hands around the cup, letting the warmth seep into my fingers. Then I heard his voice. "How are you?" It was a simple question, but this time I had an answer. "Better," I said, and for the first time in a long time, I actually meant it. And somehow, that felt like enough. I sat there staring into my coffee, the steam curling upward like a slow exhale. I could feel his eyes on me from across the room, but he didn't press. He didn't get up and walk over, didn't try to pry. He just let me sit with whatever was going on in my head. I wasn't sure why I had come back. Maybe it was the quiet. Maybe it was the way something in me had shifted after yesterday. Or maybe, just maybe, it was because, for the first time in years, someone had listened without judgment. I took a sip of coffee. It was hot, slightly bitter, but it grounded me. A few minutes passed. I figured that would be the end of it. But then I heard his chair scrape against the floor. I tensed, waiting for him to come over. But he didn't. Instead, he walked past me toward the door. He paused just before stepping outside, glanced back over his shoulder and said, "Take care of yourself." And then he was gone. Just like that. No speech, no lesson, no forced attempt at wisdom. Just a simple, human goodbye. I let out a slow breath. I had expected him to be something else. Arrogant, distant, full of himself. And yet, he wasn't. I ran my hand over my face. The door swung open again, this time letting in a gust of cold air along with someone new. A woman. She was tall, wearing a gray wool coat and dark jeans. Her auburn hair was tied back, a few loose strands framing her face. It took me a second to recognize her, and when I did, my stomach clenched. "Lisa?" She stopped, her eyes widening slightly as she looked at me. "Aaron." Her voice was careful, measured. I hadn't seen my ex-wife in almost a year. She stepped toward the counter, glancing at me again like she was debating whether to acknowledge me or not. "Coffee, please," she said, shifting her purse on her shoulder. The barista nodded, quickly going to work. Lisa turned back to me. "What are you doing here?" I swallowed. "Just having a coffee." She nodded slowly, as if deciding whether or not to believe me. Then, to my surprise, she sighed and pulled out the chair across from me. "I got your messages," she said, setting her purse down. My pulse picked up. I hadn't expected her to bring it up, at least not this soon. "Yeah?" She nodded. I wasn't sure if I wanted to respond. I let out a breath, rubbing the back of my neck. "I get that." She watched me, her eyes scanning my face like she was searching for something. "You seem different," she finally said. I blinked. "Different how?" She tilted her head slightly, considering. "Calmer." I almost laughed. Calmer wasn't a word that had ever been used to describe me. I wasn't sure what to say, so I just shrugged. "I don't know. Maybe I am." She studied me for another moment, then glanced toward the door. "The kids, they miss you." My chest tightened. "I miss them too," I said, my voice quieter than I intended. Lisa sighed, running a hand through her hair. "Look," she said, "I'm not promising anything, but maybe we can start with dinner. Somewhere public, neutral ground." I nodded quickly, almost too quickly. Yeah, yeah, that sounds great. She gave me a small, hesitant smile. Her coffee was ready. She stood, reaching for the cup, then hesitated. Don't mess this up, Aaron. I swallowed hard. I won't. She lingered for just a second longer, then turned and walked out. I sat there staring at the empty chair across from me. For the first time in a long time, I felt something that wasn't anger. Hope. Small, fragile, but real. And somehow that felt like the beginning of something new. I stayed in that cafe for a while, just sitting there, staring at the door long after Lisa had left. Her words echoed in my head. Don't mess this up. She was right to say it. I had messed up a lot in my life. Let anger get the best of me. Let pride keep me from fixing things before they got too broken. And now, for the first time in a long time, I had a chance, just a small one, to make things right. I finished my coffee and left a few bills on the table before stepping out onto the street. The air was colder now, the sun hanging lower in the sky. I pulled my jacket tighter around me and started walking. I didn't have a destination in mind, but my feet led me to a park a few blocks away. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few benches, some swings, and a patch of grass that had long since lost its green, but it was quiet. And right now, quiet felt good. I sat down on one of the benches, leaning forward, my elbows on my knees. A few minutes passed. Then I heard a voice. You again? I looked up. Donald Trump was standing a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his coat. He wasn't smiling, but there was something in his expression that wasn't quite indifference either. Me again, I said, nodding. He glanced around, then sat down on the bench across from me. Didn't expect to see you here, he said. I let out a small, dry laugh. Yeah, well, wasn't planning on it. He studied me for a moment. You look like you've got something on your mind. I shrugged, looking down at my hands. Saw my ex-wife today, I admitted. First time in a long time. Donald didn't say anything right away. He just waited. She said the kids miss me, I continued. She's willing to let me see them. Dinner, nothing more. But it's a start. Donald nodded slowly. That's good. I let out a breath. Yeah, I don't want to screw it up. Then don't, he said simply. I looked at him, expecting some kind of deeper advice, but that was all he said. Just then don't. You make it sound easy, I muttered. He shook his head. Not easy. Just simple. I frowned. What's the difference? Donald leaned back slightly. Easy means it doesn't take effort. Simple means you know what you need to do, even if it's hard. I thought about that for a moment. Maybe he had a point. I had spent years thinking that fixing things with my family was impossible, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just hard. Maybe it was about making the choice to try over and over, even when it felt like it wouldn't make a difference. I ran a hand through my hair. You ever feel like no matter what you do, people are always going to see you the way they want to? I asked. Donald gave a small, knowing smile. More than you can imagine, I scoffed. Yeah, but you're... Doesn't matter who you are, he interrupted. People judge. They assume. They make up their minds before you even open your mouth. But that's not something you can control. The only thing you can control is who you are when no one's watching. I let those words settle. Who I was when no one was watching. For years, I had let bitterness define me. I had let anger be the only thing keeping me moving. But I didn't want to be that man anymore. I didn't want my kids to see me that way. I let out a long breath and nodded. Donald stood up. Take care, Aaron. I looked up at him. You too. He gave me one last nod, then walked off, disappearing down the path. I sat there for a long time, just watching the city move around me. And then, for the first time in years, I pulled out my phone and searched for job listings. Maybe things wouldn't change overnight. Maybe Lisa wouldn't fully trust me again. Maybe my kids wouldn't immediately be excited to see me, but maybe it was enough to start with. And this time, I wasn't going to mess it up. I stared at my phone, scrolling through job listings with a mixture of hesitation and determination. Most of them were the kind of work I had done before. Construction, warehouse labor, security. Jobs that left your body aching by the end of the day, but at least gave you a paycheck. There was one at a shipping facility, night shifts, steady hours. Nothing glamorous, but reliable. I clicked on it, my thumb hovering over the Apply Now button. This was it. This was the moment. I could either take a step forward or let myself slip back into the same cycle. I exhaled slowly, then tapped the screen. Application submitted. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The next few days passed in a blur. I tried to keep myself busy, cleaned up my apartment, threw out the empty whiskey bottles that had been collecting dust, even shaved for the first time in weeks. Then on a Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't pick up, but something in me said, do it. Hello? Hi, is this Aaron, right? Yeah, who's this? This is Mike from Boston Logistics. You applied for the night shift position? My heartbeat picked up. Yeah, that's right. We'd like to bring you in for an interview. Are you available tomorrow at 2 p.m.? I sat up straighter. Yeah, I can be there. Great, see you then. The call ended, and I just sat there staring at my phone. It wasn't a job yet, but it was something. The next day, I arrived at the warehouse early. Mike, a stocky guy in his late 40s with tired eyes and a clipboard, led me into a small office. He asked the usual questions. What experience do you have? Why do you want this job? Can you handle physical labor? I answered the best I could. Then he leaned back in his chair, studying me. I gotta be honest, Aaron. I see a lot of guys come through here. Some of them work hard. Some of them don't last a week. What makes you different? I thought about that for a second. Because I don't have any other choice, I said. His eyebrows raised slightly. I need this job, I continued. Not just for a paycheck, but because I'm trying to fix things. I don't want to be the guy who keeps losing. He was quiet for a moment, then nodded. Okay, we'll give you a shot. Start Monday, 8 p.m. sharp. Don't be late. I shook his hand, firm and steady. I won't be. As I walked out of that warehouse, something inside me felt different. Like for the first time in a long time, I was actually moving forward. Saturno whenever shock that Sunday, Lisa sent me a text. Dinner tomorrow at 6. Kids will be there. Don't be late. I stared at the message, my pulse quickening. This was it. This was the real test. The next day, I stood outside the restaurant 10 minutes early, my hands in my pockets, my stomach a knot of nerves. Then I saw them. Lisa, walking up the sidewalk, and behind her, my kids. Jack, 12 years old now, taller than the last time I had seen him. Sarah, 9, holding her mom's hand but looking at me with cautious curiosity. They stopped a few feet away. Lisa gave me a look that said, "Don't mess this up." I swallowed hard, then smiled. Hey, guys. Jack shoved his hands into his hoodie pockets. Hey. Sarah tilted her head. Mom said you're trying to be better. I nodded. I am. She studied me for a moment, then took a small step closer. Can I hug you? My throat tightened. Yeah, I said, my voice rough. Yeah, you can. She let go of Lisa's hand and wrapped her arms around me. I closed my eyes, holding on to that moment, letting it anchor me. Jack didn't say anything, but when Sarah pulled away, he gave me a small nod. It wasn't much, but it was a start, and for the first time in a long time, maybe felt like enough. I sat across from them at the small restaurant table, my hands resting on my lap to stop myself from fidgeting. The menu in front of me felt like a prop, something to hold so I wouldn't have to face the weight of my own nerves. Jack flipped through his menu lazily, pretending like this wasn't a big deal, but I could see it in his posture, the way his shoulders were slightly stiff, the way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. Sarah, on the other hand, was already looking at the kids' menu with deep concentration, her little fingers tapping against the laminated page. Lisa sat beside them, arms crossed, watching me carefully. I cleared my throat. So, what are you guys thinking of getting? Sarah brightened. I want spaghetti, but only if it doesn't have weird sauce. I smirked. Weird sauce? She nodded solemnly. Last time, Mom made it, and there were chunks in it. Lisa rolled her eyes. It was just tomatoes, Sarah. Sarah made a face. Gross. I chuckled, the tension easing just a little. Jack set his menu down. I'll just get a burger. short, to the point. He was keeping his distance, and I didn't blame him. Good choice, I said. The waiter came by, took our orders, and then we were left sitting there, the awkward silence creeping in again. Lisa finally sighed. So, how have you been? It was such a loaded question. For years, the answer had been bitter, angry, lost. But now, I thought about the job I was starting tomorrow, about how I hadn't touched a drink in over a week, about how I was sitting here, right now, with my kids in front of me. I met her eyes. I've been trying. Lisa studied me for a long moment, then nodded slightly. Good. Sarah was swinging her legs under the table, completely oblivious to the quiet tension between the adults. Dad, do you still know how to do the coin trick? I blinked. The what? She huffed. The one where you make it disappear and pull it from my ear. I stared at her, surprised she even remembered that. Yeah, I said slowly. I think I do. I reached into my pocket, feeling around until I found a quarter. Sarah leaned forward, eyes wide as I palmed it, moved my fingers just right, and then, boom, I said, pulling it from behind her ear. She gasped. No way, I winked. You must be keeping money hidden back there. She giggled, taking the coin from my hand. And just like that, something inside me loosened. The food came, and dinner was nice, not perfect. Jack was still distant, and Lisa kept a careful wall up between us. But Sarah was talking, laughing, and when the check came, I reached for it. Lisa looked surprised. You don't have to. I got it, I said firmly, because for the first time in years, I could. Outside, under the streetlights, Lisa turned to me. I'll let you see them again, she said. But it's going to take time, Aaron. This isn't fixed overnight. I nodded. I know. Jack gave me another small nod, not quite ready to trust me yet, but not completely shutting me out either. And Sarah? She squeezed my hand before climbing into Lisa's car. As I stood there watching them drive away, I felt something I hadn't in a long, long time. Hope. And this time, I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. Monday night, I clocked in for my first shift. The warehouse was cold, the fluorescent lights casting everything in a harsh glow. Mike, my manager, handed me a clipboard. Think you can handle it? He asked. I looked out at the endless stacks of crates, the sound of forklifts beeping in the distance. Yeah, I said, I can. And I did, hour by hour, shift by shift, one day at a time. Every night when I came home, I checked my phone. Sometimes Lisa would text, updates about the kids, a picture of Sarah's school project. Sometimes Jack would send me a one-word response to something I sent him. It wasn't much, but it was real. And that was enough. Weeks passed, then months. One day, I walked into that same cafe where everything had started. And there he was, Donald Trump sitting at his usual table, reading a book. I hesitated for only a second before walking over. He looked up, raised an eyebrow. You again, he said. I smirked. Me again. He gestured to the empty chair across from him. So, he said, how's life? I thought about my job, about my kids, about the fact that, for the first time in forever, I actually had an answer to that question. I smiled. It's getting better. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, things started falling into place. I wasn't perfect. I still had bad days, moments where the weight of everything pressed down on me. But I didn't let it break me this time. I worked my shifts, kept my head down, and kept showing up. For my kids, for myself, for the life I thought I had lost. Lisa started trusting me again, little by little. She let me pick up Sarah from school a few times. Let Jack text me first instead of me always reaching out. One night when I dropped them off, she lingered by the car. You're doing good, Aaron, she said, crossing her arms against the cold. I nodded. Thanks. She hesitated. Don't mess it up. I won't. And for once, I believed it. But not everyone was happy to see me moving forward. One night after my shift, I found myself back at the cafe. The place had become a strange kind of anchor for me, a reminder of where everything had started to change. As I stepped inside, I felt the weight of someone's eyes on me. Mike, My old drinking buddy. The guy I used to drown my sorrows with after long shifts. The one who always told me the world was rigged against guys like us. He was sitting at a corner table, a beer bottle in front of him, even though the cafe didn't serve alcohol. I knew that look. "Look at you," he muttered, swirling the bottle in his hand. "Mr. Responsible now." "Mr. Family Man." I sighed, not in the mood for this. "What do you want, Mike?" he scoffed. "You think you're better than me now?" I clenched my jaw. "Nah," I said. "I just stopped letting anger make my choices for me." He laughed, bitter and sharp. "Anger's all we got, man. You think anything's really different? You think that job's gonna save you? Think your ex is just gonna forget everything? Nah, you're still you. And guys like us don't get second chances." I let out a slow breath. Then maybe I don't want to be guys like us anymore. For the first time, something flickered in his expression. Something like fear. Because deep down, he knew he was wrong. He just wasn't ready to admit it. He shook his head, looking down at the table. "You'll fall, just like I did." Maybe he was right. Maybe I would. But not today. I left him sitting there, drowning in his bitterness, and walked out into the cold night air. The thing about second chances is that they're only worth something if you take them, if you hold on to them. I was done letting my past define me. I was done being angry, so I kept walking. Not away from something, but toward whatever came next. Life doesn't always give you easy answers, but sometimes it gives you moments, small, unexpected moments that change everything. If you've ever felt like you were stuck, like the weight of your mistakes was too heavy to carry, I hope this story reminds you that it's never too late to start over. Now tell me, what would you do if you had a second chance? Let's talk in the comments.